Hello and welcome to Speightstown, a forgotten treasure. I'm glad you've joined us. In last week's program, we introduced you to the impact of the Amerindians on this historic town. That was followed by a discussion on the early history, that is the colonial history. In this week's program, we shall introduce you to the early economics of Speightstown.
So we are actually walking on this waterfront here, which was once part of the fortification and defense system. And in the hills and terraces behind us were the powerhouse of what was Speightstown. That is the sugar and the production that made Speightstown, as they said at the time, the little Bristol of Barbados.
Yes, because one has to look at what it was that brought Speightstown into being, and now you're touching on the economics of it. The northern parishes and the fact that this then, from the early 17th century, became a hub. And you talked about the connection between Bristol and Little Bristol. And I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on the economics of that. Trade, transport, the sinews of what ultimately became the British Empire, and Barbados's role and Speightstown's role in the North Atlantic economic system.
Well, I think that this can simply be stated if you faded out our position right here and faded in 200 years ago. This empty piece of sea behind us would be filled with merchant vessels, schooners from throughout the Caribbean, the British West Indies, but also merchant vessels coming mainly from Bristol, London, perhaps Liverpool, although Liverpool was not such a strong connection to the planters, but not in the early period. But certainly Bristol and all of the communications between Bristol and Barbados at that time were very strong. You had all the West Country and Midland people and Southern England coming, catching their ships in Bristol and then coming out to the Caribbean. So yes, this is an important economic powerhouse that then powered not only Barbados, because you found that as the other islands opened up, Barbadian investment that we know already went to the Carolinas in North America. Barbados investment also went to the newly opened up islands in the 18th century, such as Dominica, St. Vincent, and the others that were being opened up. So you have Barbadian economic power spreading to the other islands, and it continued way up into the 20th century as the commercial hub of the Eastern Caribbean.
Yes, and I think that's a role that Barbados still plays today, the role of a major hub in the Eastern Caribbean. We talked about shipping and so on, and this of course was the scene of the famous Speightstown schooner that provided a method of linking Speightstown and Bridgetown. And I know you went to Lodge School as a youngster, and you had the experience of sailing from Dominica to Barbados on a schooner. What was it like? What was it like traveling on a schooner, and how could one extrapolate? I mean, even a short trip on the schooner going from Speightstown to Bridgetown. What sort of feeling did that,
well, of course,
arouse in you?
Traveling by schooner was an extremely traditional way of traveling. My grandmother back in the 1930s, when she wanted to test whether she could take a schooner to Dominica, she got in touch with Mr. Challoner, one of the powerful Challoner families that owned these schooners
in Speightstown,
Speightstown, and asked for permission to take a trip from Bridgetown to Speightstown to see how she could steady herself on these schooners, and it was successful, and so she began these trips back and forth to Dominica. We must understand too that during the Second World War, Barbados was the center of distribution for schooners that were connecting the islands with food and supplies. You had the schooner pool based at the Carinage, and schooners were chosen by number to take supplies during the war when the U-boats, the submarines, were blowing up main international shipping, British shipping particularly.
Well, one evening during the war, the buses would come to Bridgetown from Speightstown, St. Lucie, Speightstown. The last bus came in around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It stopped there below Harrison's, C.F. Harrison's, and the passengers got out. But the ones going back down to Speightstown had to get in. And I remember a little boy, Ian Bain, he was at Harrison's College. He and I were there waiting to get any bus. And in those days, the buses had the back seats face one another. Some people sat here and some here facing one another. And this lady had a big tray of stuff she had, and she was trying to come out, but Ian was trying to get in before other people got in before him. And as he got on the steps, she hit him in his forehead, bang, and sent him flying back out. Luckily, I was standing behind him. He fell on top of me. And if not, he would have gone on the ground and probably hit his head and bursted open. Ian looked round. He said, Miss Watson, look at y'all in the schooner down there. Come, let's go home on the schooner. And he threw us across Broad Street like race horses out to the careenage. The boat was pulling away from the careenage, but when the captain saw us coming, he came back and took us on board, and I sailed right down to Speightstown on the schooner. Had a lovely sail that evening.
And these schooners were vital. So the schooners that came here and around the rest of Barbados, down by the Crane and Consets, they were loading on with sugar that would be too difficult to carry on the cart roads from one end of the island to the other. And then Speightstown became this collecting point for all of those barrels and hogsheads, just like Bridgetown was the collecting point for those in the south. And then the big ships would come from Britain, ready to load on all of this and take up to Britain. So you have all of these connections that were vital at the time. Now, what do we see here? Jet skis and a few cabin cruisers. But it's a new industry, so Speightstown's future could be related in a way to this new industry.
But hopefully one day cruise shipping as well
yes,
here.
Exactly.
Because I think that would help to revitalize the town.
Now maybe what you could do is explain to me this placement of fortifications, because there were some historic cannon around here that pointed out to sea and were some of the remnants of where the fortifications were. I know that up at the Coleridge and Parish School, we have the remains of a fort up there as well.
Dover Fort.
Dover
Yes.
Fort.
Yes.
Along this protected west coast that we see here, you found the first settlements being established, all from Carlisle Bay going right along into St. Lucie. Of course, there was intense rivalry at that time between powers, Western European maritime powers, about the claims to these islands, and therefore these fortifications were built.
All of these wars meant that the fortification had to go up. So every time there was a war, new fortification. So during the 1740s, Governor Thomas Robinson commissioned Captain John Trail to survey the island's fortifications. So when Trail reported, he talked about a battery called the Ashes Battery between Six Mens and Retreat, which had been demolished. But he talked about shoreline and coastline fortifications. There was a battery at Haywoods with 2 guns, one at Sunderland with 7 guns. There were 2 forts at Six Mens of 9 guns. That is why they built up all the time. So that was always a very important area, Six Mens. And you can see it's fishing still, you know, always something to do with the sea. There were 6 guns at Fort Rupert. And then on the hillside, there were batteries at Ishley's, 8 guns, Hall's battery of 2 guns, which is now at the site of the Coleridge and Parish School.
And so one of the last that we have here is the Dover Fort and Signal Station on the grounds of the Coleridge and Parish School, overlooking what was one of the most important harbors in Barbados, the Speightstown Harbor, which drew shipping from around the world, from Europe and from North America, and served the many very productive plantations in an area from St. Lucie going right down in possibly to St. Thomas and of course over in St. Joseph as well, bringing the produce down to the port here to ship to the major centers of trade at the time.
Colleton had 2 guns and Harrison's had 6 guns. And then there were lower hillside batteries, including Coconut Hall Battery 5 guns, which is on the old Alexandra School at Chapel Street corner.
Barbados had the problem in that close to the shore was very low indeed, and you didn't get the advantage of being able to put your fortifications at any height. However, what they did do is they used the first level of terrace. And as we go along the terrace from north to south, we will come across these fortifications, small ones put together on these sites, which had a really good panoramic view of the west coast. And then, to ensure that landings didn't take place unobserved, what they had were these various forts lined up along this terrace so that they would send signals to one another.
So you had guns at 3 levels. The high-up guns, the middle guns, and the guns down on the coast. St. Peter was guns. That wasn't the guns the Merrymen were singing about, but there were guns. Lots and lots of guns here. And then during the War of American Independence, American privateers actually came at Speightstown and captured some locally owned vessels. So you can understand why they had to have this protection, because if they had not put those in place, then the whole area might have been swept by the enemy. By 1910, the outstanding forts were Orange Fort, with over 25 guns at its peak, Denmark with its swivel platform, Fort Rupert and Dover Fort. When I talk about a swivel platform, here is a gun that you can move in different directions. The normal cannon was stationary on its carriage and only shoot in one direction. And this fella had a swivel gun. So as the ship was moving, the fellas go kapow, kapow. Hot, hot lead coming at you. Lick off the mast of the ship. If it hit you, it took off a hand, a head, whatever. So that was heavy battle in those days.
But these early little fortifications served those two purposes. One, to survey the west coast and, if necessary, defend it. And the other, to send signals from one to the other along the coast so that the actual arrival point of any possible attack would be well covered and monitored.
All designed to protect shipping, because shipping was the key. You didn't want any French people coming from Martinique and suddenly seizing all of your ships that are laden with sugar.
No, Barbados was an obvious target for the French, but in the French fleets, many French fleets attempted to invade, and in fact, in the Napoleonic period, there was actually French shipping within sight of Barbados, and then the winds changed, and once those winds shifted, that was the key to Barbados' stability, exactly. The fact that it was a difficult island to invade.
Unlike the Windward Islands, islands like Dominica, to which I'm accustomed, and St. Lucia
and St. Kitts and all those islands, yes.
You were 100 or more miles away, and you would have to try to set your sailing ships against the wind, against the swell, to be able to make a surprise attack on Barbados. That was almost impossible, because people would know that you were coming well before you arrived. Whereas in those other islands, the potential for surprise was far, far greater.
Well, yes, and Barbados had the advantage of having natural protection as well as man-made protection, because we had the East Coast, which was protected by the breakers and the reefs in the Atlantic Ocean, so invading forces could not approach from that angle. And then on the other hand, the entire west and south coast of Barbados were protected by this tremendous line of forts, some 42 forts, and then with internal fortifications as well, or batteries on higher ground, so that the cannon could train their line of fire, and you could do cross triangulation and mount a tremendous cannonade on any invading fleets approaching the island. This was successfully done, for example, in Carlisle Bay in the 1660s, when the Dutch under De Ruyter attempted to invade, and from Carlisle, from Charles Fort and Willoughby Fort, etc. The cannons just trained their cannon fire on the Dutch vessels, and they had to flee. They went to Martinique to attack Martinique.
I'm sure that the old-time Barbadians learned a lesson by ISQ's attack, and maybe in the years that followed, did some upgrading of fortification around Speightstown.
Yes, this was a constant thing, and in fact, it was a constant bugbear between the Colonial Office, then, because in the old days it was trade and plantations, and the local elite of the island, because generally speaking, the monies that were spent on the fortifications were monies that were raised locally, as opposed to monies being sent from England to build these forts. The idea of the colonial people in Britain was that you're out there in the colony by yourselves. It's your island that's going to be invaded. You must bear the responsibility and the cost of maintaining, erecting and maintaining these fortifications. But let me ask you a question now about something that I know is near and dear to the heart of many Dominicans, given your emphasis on ecotourism. And let's look at whaling, because this was a whaling center. And in fact, many humpback whales were actually taken in these waters and processed here in the 19th century. I know that there's a growing, and because I myself have been to Dominica to do whale watching, I know that whale watching is a big phenomenon now in Dominica. What are your views on this, whaling?
Well, I mean, certainly you mentioned already of the whaling industry that existed here, small as it may have been in Speightstown. And the people who participated in this and who were the kind of leaders in this were people from the eastern seaboard of the United States who came down. And of course you had your local expertise as well. We see the remnants of it mainly in Beckway in the Grenadines, but where they have been granted special rights to kill whales.
Aboriginal rights.
Aboriginal rights. But in Dominica we realize the money really is in the viewing of the whales. And although we went through a period of voting with the Japanese on whaling, because we were getting certain benefits like fisheries centers and stuff, now the Dominica tourism and the business related to whaling has risen so much that we would not consider doing this kind of thing again. And therefore, the industry, the viewing of whales, the fact that we shelve off very steeply and the whales come very close to the island, this is the key point. So that we see the economy changing. The economy is no longer a matter of getting any advantage from whale meat or whale oil as it was here, because in those days you used whale oil for lighting candles and stuff like this.
And when making, yes.
And for the blubber.
Yes.
But once times had changed and the technology had changed, there was no need for this anymore. And so this other area has evolved, and it is like a safari. You use your cameras, you don't use your shotguns or your whaling harpoons.
And you know, a dead whale is a dead whale.
Yep.
There's a very telling lithograph, 19th century lithograph, showing Barbadian fishermen in a boat about to harpoon a whale that has just breached. Well, the point is that once that whale was killed, it was utilized, and then that was the end of it. Whereas in ecotourism, you photograph a whale, and a year later, another group of people can come and photograph that same whale, and it's a sort of a resource that goes on and on and on.
Exactly.
And one could use the example, say, very successfully done here in Barbados, where once with the protection of turtles. Turtles have become now a major player in the marine tourism of Barbados. And if you go on something like TripAdvisor, you will see that a lot of comments are directed very positively on the experiences that people had, either with seeing turtles lay eggs on the beach or the Swim with the Turtles program. So there is, I mean, a lot of economic sense in making use of what nature has gifted you with, and rather than eradicating it and getting rid of it, you protect it and bring it then into a win-win situation.
Now, talking about another aspect of economic reassessment, we have the wonderful architecture of Speightstown. So maybe we should actually take a look at some of this.
Yes, Speightstown is a treasure trove waiting to be developed properly and in a controlled fashion.
Well, let's go and take a look at
some of the beautiful architecture. So Lennox, here we are on the banks of what used to be the old salt pond, Speightstown. Speightstown, one of the very earliest towns of Barbados. 4 towns, but any one of them could have had preeminence. But Speightstown, what, from your perspective, a geographical perspective and a comparative perspective, what was it that prompted the growth of Speightstown, and why ultimately did Bridgetown then eclipse Speightstown?
Well, we see throughout the plantation Caribbean these major towns scattered around the islands
particularly to act as areas, as ports for sugar and other products that are coming out from the plantations in the neighborhood. So it is a kind of catchment area, if you will, for all of the plantations associated with the north of Barbados that would be then feeding their products, their sugar, through the port of Speightstown. And this you can replicate across the Caribbean. In Jamaica, for instance, you have Morant Bay, Savannah La Mar, Port Antonio, Falmouth, all of these towns, very much like Speightstown, that are situated around the islands to feed the sugar and other products to the sailing ships. And this is the role that Speightstown would have played in the 17th and into the 18th century. And so we can see this pattern in British colonizing and British plantation organization clearly here in Speightstown. Of course, Bridgetown, as Professor Watson has said, had the preeminence eventually, but it could have been any of these towns along the coast. Of course, the great advantage of Bridgetown was Carlisle Bay and the shelter that it afforded, and of course also the careenage, which allowed small vessels to come right up into the center of the city. So it was understandable that Bridgetown would gain that preeminence. But Speightstown is very interesting too for the layout, of course, of its buildings. And they tie in very closely with the 17th century patterns that we see in the major metropolitan cities like Bristol and London, where you're trying to fit as many houses as possible onto the main streets. And therefore you have to make the end of the houses as narrow as possible to be able to fit as many of those businesses along the main street, and therefore they end up being long into the body of the square or of the main block of buildings. And we find that here in Speightstown, particularly with Arlington House.
Yes, interesting layout. And you had mentioned Falmouth, and if we compare Falmouth in Jamaica with Speightstown, similar towns, similar layouts, both with a good inner core of 18th century buildings. And we're looking at Speightstown and why is Speightstown in the doldrums? What is the potential of Speightstown? And what can possibly be done to revitalize the fortunes of Speightstown? Because I think, and it's a view shared by a number of people, that this is a little gem waiting some development in a controlled historical sense, but it is an area that has tremendous potential and can be developed for the benefit of the people of the north of Barbados in particular. And if one were to compare Falmouth and Jamaica, Falmouth is undergoing a complete regeneration at the present point in time. And one of the key points aiding in that regeneration of Falmouth is the creation of a cruise ship centre for Falmouth.
I hear Mr. Hartman talking about Old San Juan. He would like Speightstown to look like it. Boy, jump on a plane, boy. Catch a boy. This is my living. When I went to see the Old San Juan, the image of Speightstown, the old fort still there. And every morning I see a new big boat, like it won't come through the town. I go at St. John's, Antigua, but I'm betting it's at Speightstown. No. It's the town, St. John's, Antigua, challenge Antigans. I'm betting it's Speightstown. But a ship come there every morning. You go to St. Vincent, the boats turn up, and all of them don't come ashore. The Florida Cruise Association will give you a tender. I would like that contract. They bill it for you, and you get men in Barbados to bring show the people.
What are your views, Lennox, on this? I mean, do we want cruise ships coming in here? What would cruise ships docking here in Speightstown do to the economy of the town, the fortunes of the town, the demography of the town, the architecture of the town?
Well, in Dominica, we're attempting the same thing. We have the two major towns, Portsmouth and Roseau. Roseau is the capital. Portsmouth was once briefly the capital. And the efforts of tourism and investment is to push more and more for the touristic development and utilizing the history of Portsmouth, the second town of Dominica. It's a similar situation to Bridgetown, Speightstown. And what we have developed is a cruise ship berth. We're focusing on the smaller cruise ships for those ports. You have cruise ships anywhere below 800 passengers, down to 100 and maybe 60 in some of those sailing vessels. And they could be accommodated here. You've got a lot of attractions which are not necessarily attractive to mass tourism. You've got some of the historic plantations, you've got Farley Hill, and over the ridge you've got St. Nicholas Abbey. And so this is an issue that could benefit the whole area, you know.
Well, yes, because as you pointed out, there are attractions like St. Nicholas Abbey, Morgan Lewis, and then the natural history attractions, Animal Floor Cave, the beauty of River Bay, lends itself to this development. There are a lot of high-end tourism developments in the area. I mean, you have Port Charles and now you have Port Ferdinand developing, so that there's a lot of potential interest, a lot of potential wealth, a lot of potential bodies waiting, but yet it doesn't seem to have come together. And we've talked and talked about the potential of Speightstown, but yet we've never done anything really concrete to realize that potential. And as we walk, I'm sure we'll see structures that fascinating 18th century structures, but yet languishing, like for example the Noel Roach Pharmacy, which is, and I'd value your opinions on it, because I see some architectural attributes to that building and others in Speightstown which reflect a sort of French Creole architectural influence. I see more dormer windows, for example, here in Speightstown than elsewhere. I even see one or two buildings with that barn type roof line that one sees so readily in Castries and other towns in the Caribbean that were influenced by French colonization. I don't know, what's your view on this?
Well, we can certainly look at some of these buildings and assess them, but there will have to be a lot of major capital investment, particularly for the berthing of those smaller cruise ships here at Speightstown, if you were going to develop that. So there would have to be some initial state or corporate involvement to begin with, to set the stage for the utilization of these buildings to be turned into things like, you know, duty-free and other kinds of things. We do already have some things like art galleries and small shops, some very charming little restaurants that could be expanded and developed. But I think that what you would have to do, the tourism authorities, is to develop a type of package associated with Speightstown that isn't necessarily the type of package that you'd put in huge buses down in Bridgetown. This is a totally different...
So to offer something that has a unique Speightstown.
This is a different product.
We're offering the charm.
Exactly, and not only the charm of Speightstown, but the charm of the sites and attractions around Speightstown, into the hills and even over into Bashaba. We talk about St. Nicholas Abbey, a number of these areas here, the St. Lucie. These are areas that could be tapped to focus on Speightstown as a development area.
From the economics of colonial Speightstown to the potential, a subject which will be discussed in a later program. Well, that's it for this program. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Do join us next week at the same time when we continue our look at the questions Speightstown, a forgotten treasure. Have a wonderful week ahead. Good evening.